morning and welcome to Bolton. I'm Joyce Stilley, the Administrative Officer for the Town of Bolton, and this is a live show done the first and the third Tuesdays of each month from 10:30 to 11 a.m. The show is rebroadcast on the second and fourth Tuesdays at the same time period. The show is a continuing effort to promote open communications within the community, and if you have an upcoming event or an organization you would like to get some PR out about, or just have a question about how town government operates, please contact me at the town hall and we will try to get a show on the air that covers that topic. As we are progressing during this budget season, as we had discussed at the last show, Bob Monroe was my guest then, and he is a return visitor, Chairman of the Board of Finance. Bob Monroe, welcome.
Thank you, Joyce. It's nice to be here again.
Well, and we talked about the last one was just before the public hearing, and now the public hearing has happened, and the Board of Finance has actually set a budget for the upcoming referendum, which we should take a moment to talk about. Is May 21st at Town Hall from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., and we encourage people to vote. But let's talk about the public hearing first. And then we'll move into the budget itself.
Okay. Well, as you mentioned, we had the public hearing this past Tuesday. It was not as well attended as I would have liked. There were numerous officials from the town, from various boards, including the Board of Education, Board of Selectmen, but aside from the town officials, probably 10 or less non-affiliated citizens, if you would. And as a consequence, there really weren't very many questions or anything, which is, I would like to see more people and more questions. It's important from my perspective, and I believe from every person on the Board of Finance at this time, to have the benefit of what people are saying and what people are thinking in regards to the budget and budget process. And so it really was fairly short, with the exception that I probably got too verbose a few times. But other than that, it went well. There were no major objections voiced by those members of the public. There certainly were some critical comments made by some of the boards who might have seen reductions as a consequence of the Board of Finance's actions, which was understandable, and we were expecting that.
Well, and that's, the budget that's being proposed, we should start out with revaluation having occurred. That some people will see a tax increase, some people will see a tax decrease, and some people will stay exactly where they are, because the Board of Finance, the budget that's moving forward, has no change in the mill rate. It's flat.
The reval is done every 5 years. The previous revaluation occurred on the heels of the downturn in 2008. It occurred in 2014, I believe, and based upon real estate values, which drives the grand list, the real estate values had really taken a tumble during that period after the 2007-2008 recession. And so it did come back as a consequence. Valuations in town had moved up during this time period. There's been new construction as well. Those two things added together actually created a situation where the town was going to realize around $240,000 worth of additional income based upon a flat mill rate. That bulge, if you will, of almost $240,000 allowed us to put that money towards this budget and minimize the reductions that we had to make in the requests from the various boards, and also allowed us to maneuver a little bit to keep the mill rate flat at 39, which was not necessarily, it didn't have to be a goal of the Board of Finance, but it seemed within reach.
Yes.
And the board rallied around that thought, and the reductions that were made were driven by that, I think, in the end. And we did, at this point, achieve that goal. The budget we're offering to the public for a referendum on Tuesday, May 21, we'll be offering, and it contains no increase in the mill rate. It'll stay at 39.
And that's, the growth in the grant list was actually 1.8%. And some people might say, well, 1.8%, that's not very much. You have to remember, in Bolton, we're different than a Manchester, we're different than a Vernon, we're different than a Glastonbury, in that we are just over 90% residential.
Right.
And less than 10% is that commercial, agricultural, industrial. So we struggle to get consistent growth in the grand list, especially as there's fewer and fewer acreage available for even subdivisions in the town, as we're working to preserve open space as well.
The grand list tells a very interesting story, and part of the presentation we made to the public included some historic information on the mill rate, and I could share that with the listeners here today. Going back to 2014, we had a increase in the grand list of 0.004%. That's almost not even measurable.
Right.
The following year, it moved up to 13/100%. The year after that, up to 0.6%, then dropped back slightly from that growth to 0.56. But this year, 1.84, and it really made a substantial difference. It was good news on a number of fronts.
Yes.
Not only did it provide additional money in support of the budget, but it also showed the valuation of properties in the town had started to catch up with the decreases that had occurred years previous. And you're correct. I mean, we have a very small town, and I mean, it even has the distinction, I think, of being maybe the smallest or one of the smallest towns in area, square miles. So I'm not sure where we stand in that, but it's very close to being the
15
smallest.
square miles is not very big.
Right. So we have, we have a limited amount of space, but building does continue apace, a fairly steady but moderate pace, which hopefully will continue into the future, and provide some, additional housing opportunities for people to come to Bolton. And hopefully we see a little bit more commercial over the time.
Right. And so let's go back to the date of the public hearing. That was also a momentous day on another front that certainly impact the budget, because that is the date that the town and the Board of Ed, Kristen Hecht as superintendent and myself as administrative officer, signed an agreement for shared services for a facilities director. Perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
This was an effort that I applaud and did applaud as it was progressing forward. I was more of an observer to this process, but I hopefully did provide a little bit of valuable input. But an opportunity existed with the retirement of a long-term employee on the Board of Education side to combine the management of town facilities under one person. That existing staff person is actually employed on the Board of Selectmen side, but it will provide, in my opinion, a very consistent review of the facilities, that review should be constant and ongoing, so that we do truly understand the needs of the facilities. And I think the concerns that were expressed during that process by Kristen Hecht, the superintendent of schools, as you mentioned, were adequately addressed. And I think the signing of that agreement shows that. I was very impressed with the amount of detail that went into this analysis and the plan for this transition of duties, to the extent that that working group, which included yourself and Kristen, identified every specific duty that had been performed by the previous incumbent. And I believe that they've been adequately, properly assigned, in part to a new position, a lower level position in maintenance, with the supervisory responsibilities being concentrated in one position. So I think it's a very good move for the town. As the hearing unfolded and in subsequent previous meetings, the intention was to try to save additional town dollars through this, and that was achieved. I think in the end we can point to a little over $50,000 worth of savings to the town.
Correct.
As a result of this effort. And hopefully, not only in addition to the savings, but we're going to improve the efficiency of that process, and hopefully at the same time have a much more consistent review of our building needs.
And part of this, from the town's perspective, is as you talked about before, all of our supervisors are working supervisors. We're just too small to not be able to have them do work. Now, with this additional responsibilities, though, we are taking what was going to be a temporary summer position to help mow the greenways now that the greenway is open, and make that a permanent full-time maintainer position to add a staff person. But the overall impact to the town side is only expected to be about $85,000, which you had previously added to our budget and cut from the Board of Ed's budget prior to public hearing, which we had talked about before. So there's still details to be worked out, but key in this agreement is that further discussions will take place, because we're hoping this is just the start of working together, buildings and grounds wise, with the unions and personnel and boards to further the shared services.
I think in the past there's been real concrete and examples of the Board of Education employees on one hand and the Board of Selectmen employees on the other hand working together. This occurred in a few major snowstorms, as an example, when all hands were not on deck but on the roof of the high school and center school, as I recall. And they worked very well together. And there was an additional very big effort on the baseball field, as I recall. So these two staffs being united and being able to draw on each other's strengths and weaknesses and individual skills, I think is a very good thing for both boards, and will contribute in the long run to a much more efficient operation, and one that hopefully addresses where we can actually bring people from both sides of our organization together to accomplish maybe bigger tasks even that were not considered feasible previously.
And that's exactly what I'm talking about. I think this is just the start. Unfortunately, I won't be here to witness the end result, but it's a start, and a very important one. And you know, the taxpayers are saving this money now. The thought is down the road, we're not looking to eliminate any positions whatsoever, but your capital equipment needs will change as a result of this, and that's further savings. You're going to avoid some of those future costs, so that's an ongoing item.
The duplication of equipment, if you're trying to have people do basically the same job, say, snow removal as an example, in 3 or 4 different buildings, it can, you know, it's reasonable to just picture that and think that, okay, if we're all doing this at the same time, you're going to need more equipment. Right. So, I mean, this is just an easy example of where our future equipment demands could be less, as a consequence, and simply prioritizing where the staff are working on these particular duties based upon the weather. But most importantly, and then I know that you guys worked hard to recognize this, to meet the particular demands of the schools where you're on a particular schedule and you have to have the school ready, the sidewalks ready for people to utilize them to get into the school. And I think that was one of the clear concerns that the Board of Education had, and I think that the town has gone a long way to satisfy those demands, and that again is evidenced by the fact that both boards signed that agreement.
Yes, definitely. So the action, following the public hearing, the Board of Finance had a special meeting to discuss the budget to move forward to referendum. Mm-hmm. And there was no change in the bottom line expenditures, nor was there any change in the revenue side at this point. And this budget still does contain basically the governor's proposed budget, which includes the teacher's retirement and a reduction in ECS.
There was a little bit of tinkering. The purpose of the public hearing is to hear from people other than town officials.
Yes.
About what their feelings are about the budget, the allocation of money between the boards, and to get proper answers to questions that they might have from the Board of Finance, which gives us the opportunity to express the fact that we've been very diligent in trying to understand, and we spent a year trying to understand the financial situation that both boards find themselves in, and the consequence of the town as a whole, resulting in a budget. So we want to typically hold a meeting after the public hearing to find out if there's been information provided that would make us want to reconsider any or all of that budget. And as I mentioned before, there was very little public input in this regard. We did do a little bit of fine-tuning when we went into our meeting after the public hearing, to the extent that we wanted to just make sure that we had captured the savings that we were telling the public about in regards to the shared services. That was done by an adjustment of an additional $15,000 added to the Board of Selectmen's budget and $15,000 less to the Board of Education's budget, which hopefully then it was allowed us to have a much more accurate statement of what the costs for both sides of the town would be. And so that was accomplished as well as a final piece of adjustments to the Board of Finance's recommendation to the public.
And so the budget itself as proposed, the capital improvements budget is $548,711, and that includes capital reserve items, which is a little bit over $1 million right now, and capital improvement items that the Board of Selectmen are looking to do in the next year. The teacher's retirement, as we discussed, is in the budget for $41,244,000, and this is just the tip of that iceberg for the teacher's retirement because of the uncertainty of if it's going to be approved as part of the budget or not. It has its own line item this year, but certainly discussions are it might go to the Board of Ed's budget in the future since it actually is for teachers' retirement. It's a benefit. Did you want?
Yeah, in the previous show that we did on the budget, I think we both stressed the fact that historically we've responded to the governor's proposed budget well as we're preparing ours, and as mentioned before, the interstate budget process is still going on. We've basically all but completed ours. So if we get a positive response on the 21st with the referendum and it's approved, the town budget process completes earlier than the states. So yes, we have reserved monies in this budget for an allocation to the teacher's retirement, and also additional money, which actually reflects, additional general fund money reflects a decrease in the educational grant, the main educational grant that we get. So we don't know where these things are going to end up. Right now, we haven't not necessarily planned for a worst case scenario, because we have actually brought down the level of the contingency fund by, I believe, about $120,000. It would now sits, or it must be 127 or something like that. The contingency fund under this proposed budget would come in at around $91,000.
Correct.
The worst case scenario that we've heard, I believe, and as we were discussing earlier, I don't think anything's changed, would be that this accelerated allocation of costs, or decreasing ECS to get to to complete an adjustment to the towns of less ECS money, which would then allow the state to address bigger problems in the bigger school systems in the state, which have a harder time raising money. So this phase-in initially was going to be, like, I believe, 10 years?
Correct.
Was now under Governor Lamont's, one of his proposals, to decrease to 5 years.
Correct.
Which quickened the pace and increased the amount of money that decreased the amount of money that the town would get. So yeah, over $42,000 reserved for the retirement, and I believe about $117,000 reserved for ECS. But if we end up with a worst case scenario, we could still conceivably handle that through the contingency fund.
Right.
But it does leave next year and the years after this phase-in of decreased ECS monies that we're going to have to contend with in future years.
Definitely. And along with that, certainly there's all kinds of uncertainties out there, and you will see the teacher's retirement is proposed to essentially double for next year what's coming out of this year. So next year will be more interesting depending on how this year winds up.
More difficult, without question.
Yes.
And as we talked about the grand list a bit earlier,
Yes.
I'm very hopeful that we're going to continue to see some growth in the grand
Yes.
list, which will make it a bit easier to deal with. But I think that next year is already shaping up to be a challenging year, given the possibility of, as I mentioned, the accelerated decreases in ECS and further commitments by the towns required to pay for teachers' retirement.
So also in the budget, debt service is at $1,081,601, which is down about $10,000 from current year. Town proper request was reduced by $35,000, and Board of Education reduction was reduced by $124,120. And both of those also had that 85,000 change in them. But that comes up with a total budget of $22,253,789 is what's going to referendum. That's the question. And that is, we should also point out to people, that's the question that's being voted on. What is the expenditure level? Then the Board of Finance, when they set the mill rate, take into account changes in the current financial situation as to projected state revenues, town revenues, when you set the mill rate.
Correct. What that does is provide the Board of Finance a final opportunity to make some fine-tuning adjustments based upon more recent information coming from the state of Connecticut. I still remain of the opinion, I know you're aware of this, that the state of Connecticut is going to realize a far greater positive financial position by the time everything's tallied for the end of this fiscal year than most people think. I think that we're going to see a rainy day fund in the state of Connecticut that's going to approach $2.7 billion. This is my personal opinion. with a surplus as defined in the new budget scheme of about $500,000. So that would mean that the state of Connecticut would be, under my belief, collecting approximately 2.0 to $2.2 billion more than was anticipated.
Right.
For a large number of reasons, which I don't know if we have time to get into.
Not today.
Right.
We just have 1 minute to wrap things up. Final thought?
Yes, Joyce. And I wanted to use this last minute to congratulate you on a very long and wonderful career on behalf of the people of the town of Bolton. I mentioned earlier about public participation and how
Yes.
I was a little dismayed that there were so few people at the public hearing. But this effort that you've put together here, even as an example, putting it out on important topics for the citizens of this town to hear about and you instituted a TV show. To me, it exemplifies the type of creativity you brought to this position. And you star in your own TV show, but you've been a star for this town for 31 years.
Thank you.
And I would just like you to know that it's appreciated.
Thank you, thank you. On that note, I encourage people to vote on May 21st. My next show will actually be the Recreation Director talking about summer programs. And thank you to Community Voice Channel for its continued support. And I will see you in 2 weeks.